At long last, the battle has ended. And thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever.
All right, this is lecture number 6, African Independence Movements. So we've already learned a little bit about the effects of European rule on African nations. We know that many of these effects are still evident today throughout the African continent. So how did African colonies gain their independence from colonial rule? Well, we're going to learn about these things today. So today's lecture focuses on 4 key ideas. First, since winning independence, we're going to see the different paths that many African nations have taken in recent times as they undergo this transformation from European colonies to modern nations. Secondly, we're going to further explore the patterns of colonial rule and look at how particular European nations directly impacted and influenced post-colonialism in Africa. Today's lecture will also focus on the idea of African nations as developing nations. So we're going to look at population growth and change across the African continent and discuss the problems associated with such growth in these developing nations. Finally, today's lecture will focus on urbanization in Africa and how this change in lifestyle is influencing modern technology there today. All right, so let's get started. In order to understand the 4 focuses that I've just listed, we need to understand African nationalism. What is nationalism? Well, nationalism is pride, love, or devotion to one's nation. What does this have to do with African nations gaining their independence from European countries? Everything. By the early 1900s, many Africans wanted the Europeans gone. People who believed in independence for Africans were known as nationalists. Nationalism became a powerful force for these nationalist leaders, who sought to inspire their fellow Africans to resist foreign rule by Europeans. Sometimes these nationalist leaders used violence as a tactic to rid themselves of foreign rule. Some nationalists resisted European influence and rule using peaceful means like protests. Whichever method they chose, nationalist leaders longed for self-determination. Self-determination is a term that means the right to determine or decide the best form of government or rule for a particular group of people. This is a term we will use throughout this year and next year as 10th graders. Self-determination basically means that people can decide their own form of government. Some people might choose democracy. Some people might choose a dictatorship or extreme socialism. But self-determination is the right to choose whatever form one wishes. Europeans were often hesitant to give self-determination to the people they ruled. The common argument was, oh, well, what if they choose a type of government that's different from ours? Many European nations felt that they were justified in ruling African nations for this reason. They were reluctant to give up control, especially if it meant that the newly freed nation would choose a drastically different form of government from the Europeans. Well, self-determination is important. It allows people to make these decisions for their own good. Nationalist leaders throughout Africa wanted self-determination. Many of them embraced the belief that being able to decide their own fate or form of government was far more important than allowing their nations to be ruled by a foreign power. Many nationalist leaders emerged following the arbitrary drawing of boundaries at the Berlin Conference in 1884. Diverse groups of people had been stuck together under these boundaries without regard to the tribal histories of many of the tribes grouped together. At first, many of these tribes fought against one another under these new boundaries. Many Europeans took advantage of this type of ethnic rivalry, often encouraging groups to argue and fight. In a way, it legitimized or justified European rule. The Europeans often considered themselves peacekeepers when these tribes fought, and they could play sort of a savior role. Soon, many African nationalists began calling for various tribes to put aside their differences and ethnic rivalries in order to win independence. This desire to make Africa stronger by uniting all tribes with the sole purpose of ousting Europeans from Africa became known as Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism called for the unification of all of Africa. In fact, people who believed in the concept of Pan-Africanism came up with a slogan, so write this down: Africa for the Africans. Yes, this slogan, Africa for the Africans, is pretty clear. Europeans are not welcome here. So let's take back this continent. Back in 8th grade, you probably learned about 2 leaders who embraced this nationalist movement in the States, including W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey.
William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, later known as W.E.B. Du Bois, was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, on February 23, 1868. As a young man, Du Bois received a B.A. from Fisk University before becoming the first African American to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard in 1895.
What is impressive about W.E.B. Du Bois, when he went to Harvard, they wouldn't accept his 4-year Fisk degree. Du Bois also faced the problem of not being allowed to stay on the Harvard campus after 6 p.m. So if you put it in context historically, it was a great feat.
While teaching at Atlanta University, Du Bois produced a number of academic works, including The Philadelphia Negro in 1899, the first case study of a black community in the United States.
Du Bois went into these blighted areas. He found a population that had terrible health issues, a lot of social ills such as poverty, high infant mortality, prostitution. He didn't entirely excuse the African American population, but in his analysis, he was very forceful about pointing out racism as a reason for a lot of these ills.
Both Du Bois and Booker T. Washington emerged as advocates of their race. However, as an alternative voice to Washington's book, Up From Slavery, Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk in 1903.
It was an absolutely unique book. It contains poetry, autobiographical sketches, historical articles, memoir, a wide-ranging representation of the diversity of black experience.
In 1905, Du Bois founded the Niagara Movement, opposing Booker T. Washington's racial accommodation theory. The organization became the forerunner of the NAACP, and years later, Du Bois was appointed editor of the NAACP magazine, The Crisis.
Du Bois wanted The Crisis to have two main components: protest on the one hand and uplift on the other. At the same time that he was protesting lynching and race riots, he was building a consciousness.
While continuing his work for civil rights, Du Bois published his first novel, The Quest of the Silver Fleece, in 1911. 4 years later, he published The Negro, the first general history of black Africans.
He was one of the early scholars who felt like you could not understand the status and condition of blacks in the United States unless you came to terms with the status and condition of Africa.
In 1920, Du Bois published the first of his 3 autobiographies, entitled Darkwater, Voices from Within the Veil. Then in 1935, Du Bois published his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction in America.
With his 3 autobiographies, and in a sense you could say his body of work, Du Bois gave us a document of what it was like to be black in the American century.
While becoming more influenced by communism, Du Bois made a losing bid for the New York State Senate at the age of 82. By 1961, Du Bois joined the Communist Party and moved to Ghana, where he died on August 27, 1963.
W.E.B. Du Bois can be deemed arguably the most profound African-American intellectual of his generation. His ideas are still highly relevant for the present generation of scholars.
Well, in Africa, there were many well-known African nationalists who embraced the Africa for Africans mentality and fought for self-determination. One of the most well-known of these was Leopold Sédar Senghor. He is listed in your notes. Senghor was an African Senegalese poet. He helped lead a nationalist Pan-African movement in Africa called the Negritude movement. The Negritude movement was a call for African people to take pride in their respective heritages. Senghor was educated in Europe, but used his education to urge Africans to take pride in their uniqueness and reject the traditional European view of Africa. Senghor's Negritude movement eventually led to Senegal becoming independent from France in 1960. He served as Senegal's president for 20 years. Although he passed away in 2001, he still inspires Africans to embrace the notion of Pan-Africanism. Senegal was not the only country, of course, to gain its independence from European rule. In fact, many African nations began gaining their independence following World War II. The end of World War II really marked an end of European colonization around the world. Colony after colony will gain independence, from Africa to Southeast Asia. Nationalistic movements certainly were not limited to Africa. we learn how India, or we're going to learn how India gained its independence from the British following World War II, and this will occur in our next unit of study. Well, with the Cold War beginning following World War II and lasting from until 1989 to 1990, many African nations gained their independence as European nations and the U.S. involved themselves in Cold War conflicts instead of colonialism. By 1950, only 4 nations in Africa had gained their independence. However, once the Cold War began to heat up during the 1950s and 60s, many new nations were born. One of these nations was Ghana. Ghana had been a British colony called the Gold Coast. They reverted back to their traditional name of Ghana once the British left. Ghana was able to use its independence to a large extent due to the efforts, or they were able to gain its independence rather to a large extent, due to the efforts of a nationalist leader named Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah was educated in Europe. Using political ideas he learned in Europe, he encouraged the people of Ghana to use peaceful means to get rid of the British. He called on his people to boycott British goods. A boycott is when you refuse to buy a certain product in order to make a political statement. Nkrumah went to jail several times for his efforts. Peacefully boycotting is an example of civil disobedience or passive resistance. We will learn all about peacefully protesting against a foreign power when we study Gandhi next unit. The point is, using peaceful methods, Nkrumah helped Ghana become the first black African nation to win its independence in 1957. So, which other countries gained their independence? Well, during the 1950s, the French colonies of Tunisia and Morocco peacefully won their independence, for the most part. So did Libya from Italy. However, some nations engaged in violent struggle for self-determination. An example of where this took place? Algeria. Algeria was a French colony, but many white French people had settled there during the colonial era and considered themselves French, and they resisted independence. An 8-year civil war ensued, killing over 100,000 Algerians and 10,000 French. In 1962, the Algerians finally gained independence from France. Another nation that gained its independence from Great Britain was Kenya. Led by nationalist leaders like Jomo Kenyatta, Kenyan nationalists demanded independence. The problem? The British did not wish to relinquish control over the nation. Many British nationals had settled in Kenya and had lived there for generations. Some Kenyans used violence to rid themselves of foreign rule and get rid of the European influence. One group of people who resisted foreign rule in Kenya included the Mau Mau. The Mau Mau used violence and armed resistance against the British. They actively engaged in terrorism to force the British out. The British accused Kenyatta of being a member of the Mau Mau nationalist group, although whether or not he actually belonged to the Mau Mau is questioned even today. After many years of bloody conflict, the British finally withdrew in 1964. Jomo Kenyatta, who had previously been imprisoned for resisting British rule, became the first president of an independent Kenya. In addition to the violent struggles of Algeria and Kenya for independence, southern African nations also experienced violence. Angola and Mozambique, colonized by the Portuguese, engaged in violent guerrilla warfare against their European oppressors. Guerrilla warfare means hit-and-run warfare, where fighters quickly attack people by surprise and then retreat. It can be very disorienting for opponents in war. In 1975, Angola and Mozambique gained their independence, but not before experiencing much bloodshed on the road to said independence. Thanks for listening. Bye.
At long last, the battle has ended.